right, hey there again, third grade. We are going to read chapter 40 together, Mexico and Her Neighbor. This is perhaps one of my favorite chapters in our Story of the World book because, it's about our state that we live in. It's about Texas and how it became part of the United States. And I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, which is where Alamo is. I grew up hearing about all of these famous people that helped to make Texas a republic and independent of Mexico. So it's a pretty cool chapter. It is our Texas history. So here we go. Let's go ahead and get started. And if you would like to follow along, I recommend doing that. Take out your Story of the World book if you haven't already and open up to page 367. 367. And this section is called Remember the Alamo. The brand new Republic of Mexico had a problem. It had barely been free from Spain for 10 years, and already one of its states was rebelling against Mexico. Texas, the Mexican state farthest to the north, was home to Mexicans, but it was home to even more people of English descent, called Anglos. Back when New Spain still belonged to the Spanish Empire, an American banker named Moses Austin, and here's a picture of Moses Austin. An American banker named Moses Austin and his son made an agreement with Spain that would allow American settlers to live in the northern part of the Spanish colony. These American settlements in the Spanish land were called impresarios. So again, impresarios, if you want to mark this in your book, it would be a good thing to mark. Impresarios means American settlements in the Spanish land. So it's almost like little towns, little settlements that Americans made in Spanish land. Now that Mexico was free, the Congress made another agreement with the United States so that American settlement could continue. The impresarios were good for Mexico. Few people lived in the dry, hot plains. American settlers would build prosperous new towns in this empty part of Mexico and pay plenty of taxes to the Mexican government. The United States agreed that any Americans settling in Mexico would become citizens of Mexico, convert to Catholicism, which was the official religion of Mexico, and obey Mexican law. But as time went on, Mexicans began to be annoyed with the impresarios. And let me point out this picture I have here on the screen. Famous impresarios. So these were men that were famous for starting those American settlements in the Spanish land. So you have Moses Austin pictured there, Stephen F. Austin, Martin de Leon, Green DeWitt, and Erasmo Seguin. And these are all towns that are still named after these men in Texas. Okay, where was I? So many Americans had settled in Texas that now more Texans spoke English than Spanish. The Americans did pay their taxes, but many of them refused to be Catholic or follow Mexican laws. Worst of all, Americans insisted on bringing their slaves to Texas, even though slavery was illegal in Mexico. When Congress objected, most of the Americans just ignored them. In 1830, Mexico announced that no more Americans could come into Texas to live. The Americans in Texas didn't like this order. It seemed that the Congress of Mexico was behaving like that old English Parliament again, telling them what to do without asking them for their opinion. Back in Mexico City, the American president was defeated in an election by the popular general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. There we go. Just a year later, Santa Anna made himself the dictator of Mexico. That meant Santa Anna wanted all of Mexico to obey him without question. And he thought that the Anglos, the English Americans that lived in Texas, he thought that the Anglos up in Texas were too independent. He ordered a new law passed. No one in Texas could have a gun unless the Mexican government gave them permission. Boy, was that a mistake. Any Texan who owned an illegal gun would be convicted of piracy and hung. The Texans were furious. Everyone in Texas had guns. They hunted for game and protected themselves from wild animals with their guns. Texans refused to follow Santa Anna's new gun law. All over Texas, settlers began to talk about fighting for their freedom against Santa Anna. They started to collect weapons together and to form little garrisons or gatherings of armed men all over Texas. One of these garrisons remembered that years before, a nearby settlement had been given a cannon to defend itself from attack by Native Americans. The settlement hadn't needed the cannon for years. As a matter of fact, they buried it in a big pit. Now they dug it up again and cleaned it out. No cannonballs were left, so the Texans stuffed chains and pieces of iron into it instead. And kiddos, this is the actual, as far as I know, it looks like this is in a museum. So I'm pretty sure this is the same cannon that the Texans used here. Notice the date, again, 1835. The nearest Mexican army outpost demanded that the Texans give up the cannon. The Texans refused. Mexican soldiers marched to the garrison to take it away. When they arrived, they found the Texans ready for a fight, waving a flag that said, "Come and take it." I'm sure most of you have seen a sticker, or even some people still fly these flags in Texas today. So that's where this came from. It came from when Texas was part of Mexico, and Mexico was trying to take away their guns, and they said, "Come and take it. We're not going to give up our guns. We're going to fight for our freedom to have guns." The Mexicans backed away, but as far as the Texans were concerned, the war with Mexico had begun. Signs went up all through the impresarios. "Free men of Texas! To arms! To arms!" the signs read. "Now's the day and now's the hour." Texans armed with guns and cannons took over the southern towns of San Antonio and Gonzales. Meanwhile, 59 delegates from all over Texas met together in a settlement on the northern Brazos River. They called this settlement their new capital city, Washington on the Brazos, after the capital city of the United States. So, as you all know, the capital of our country is called Washington, D.C. So that's how they came up with the name for Washington on the Brazos. Remember, I just read that this little wooden building here is located by the Brazos River, which is in Texas. But they named it Washington on the Brazos after our capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. and because it was by the Brazos River. So it's kind of hard to see maybe, but the sign, the black in front of the little wooden building, says a birthplace of Texas. So you can actually go there over by the Brazos River. It's south. So if you go south from here where we live, you can actually go to Washington on the Brazos. Together, the delegates wrote a constitution for Texas. They voted to make a huge, quick-tempered frontiersman named Sam Houston the general of the new Texas Army. It took Sam Houston weeks to gather an army. Meanwhile, Santa Anna had ordered his army to march north into Texas. Sam Houston sent a message to the Texans of the South. "Hold out as best you can," Houston ordered them. "We'll come as soon as we're able." The Texans at San Antonio, closest to the border, prepared for war. Some of the best fighters in Texas had gathered here. Jim Bowie was so famous for his bravery and daring that a hunting knife, the Bowie knife, had been named after him. He had ridden alligators in Louisiana, sailed with pirates in the ocean nearby, and mined for gold in Texas. Davy Crockett, a Tennessee frontiersman who had fought against the Creek Indians, came down to help out too. By early February, the little group of soldiers in San Antonio had grown to 189. They thought that Santa Anna's army was still weeks away, but Santa Anna was just over the river, a few miles away. When the commander of the San Antonio fighters, William Travis, realized that Mexican soldiers would arrive in just a few hours, he ordered all of his soldiers into the nearby fort. This fort, built years before by Catholic priests as a mission, a center for Catholic worship, had a wall around it. The Texans called it the Alamo. On February 23, 1836, the Mexican army reached the Alamo. 4,000 Mexican soldiers surrounded the 189 Texan rebels. Santa Anna ran up a red flag over his men. This was a military code that meant surrender without conditions. The Texans refused. William Travis sent a rider from the fort, carrying a letter that appealed for help. "To the people of Texas," he wrote, "the enemy has demanded a surrender. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. I call upon you in the name of liberty to come to our aid. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death." But no one was close enough to come. For 12 days and nights, the Texans fired at the Mexican army while the Mexicans shot cannonballs into the Alamo. On the 13th day of the siege, the Mexican soldiers made a final attack. They climbed the walls and poured into the fort. Texans and Mexicans fought with swords and knives up and down the stairs of the fort, in its dark hallways and tunnels. In less than half an hour, 30 minutes, all of the Texans were dead. The 189 men had killed 600 Mexican soldiers and wounded hundreds more. The Alamo had fallen, but all across Texas, Texans rose up to fight against Santa Anna. "Remember the Alamo!" they shouted as they gathered together, with Sam Houston in their lead. Santa Anna had captured San Antonio, but his plan to capture Texas was doomed. Okay, so let me ask you a few questions before we move on to the next section in our book. Okay, so why, can you explain in your head, or maybe out loud if you want to, why Mexico and the Mexican state of Texas started to fight with each other? Why did they start to fight with each other? Well, for a few reasons. There was kind of one big reason, but it started out as Mexico agreed to let Americans settled in the Mexican state of Texas if they would become Catholics, if they would become Mexicans and obey Mexican law. American settlers refused to obey the Mexican law. So Mexico said that no more Mexicans could live in Texas. Then Santa Anna, did I say Mexican? No more Americans could live in Texas. Then Santa Anna became dictator of Mexico, and he said that no one in Texas could have a gun without permission. And that was the last straw for the Texans. So the settlers in Texas decided to be independent. They drew up their own constitution and made Sam Houston their new general. So what happened at the Alamo? Okay, so at the Alamo, Santa Anna and the Mexican army, they arrived at the Alamo earlier than the men, only the 189 men at the Alamo, earlier than they thought. So Santa Anna demanded that the Texans surrender, but they refused. After 13 days of fighting, the Mexicans climbed the walls and ended up killing all of the Texans that were at the Alamo. But the Texans, we remember the Alamo because all those men fought so bravely. And they ended up killing around 600 Mexicans and then wounded many. So that was pretty amazing for only 189 men. All right, so we're going to move on to the Mexican-American War. So the war was not over yet between Mexico and Texas. So let's see what happens. Page 370. Santa Anna was angry. The Mexican state of Texas was filled with American settlers who refused to obey him. His army had captured San Antonio, but towns all over the north of Texas were filled with Sam Houston's men. "If they fight against me," Santa Anna snarled, "I will cut them to pieces. I will march all the way to Washington and plant the flag of Mexico there." Santa Anna never marched an army to Washington, but the fight with Texas would soon turn into a much bigger fight, a war with the whole United States. Santa Anna's army marched from San Antonio further into Texas, where Sam Houston waited at the town of San Jacinto with 900 men. Less than a month after the Alamo fell, Santa Anna camped less than a mile away from Sam Houston's army. That's not very far. He didn't think that the ragged Texas soldiers were much of a threat. He didn't even post watchmen at the edge of his camp. Instead, the Mexican soldiers lay down for their usual afternoon nap, called a siesta. Houston's soldiers burst from the trees nearby. Mounted Texas soldiers thundered into the camp, firing their guns. Sleepy, startled Mexicans scrambled for their weapons, but it was too late. In 18 minutes, the Texans had killed 700 Mexican soldiers and had captured 700 more. Santa Anna himself, surprised in his tent, was under guard. The Mexicans surrendered. Most of them repeated over and over, "No Alamo, no Alamo." They didn't want the Texans to think that they had taken part in the siege of the Alamo. They might be killed at once. Sam Houston ordered the prisoners spared. Santa Anna was forced to sign a treaty recognizing Texas as an independent republic. So they weren't part of the United States yet, but they were an independent, not state, but land, republic. Then he was sent under guard to Washington, where President Andrew Jackson met him. "What if the United States were to buy Texas from Mexico?" Andrew Jackson suggested. "Then the fighting between Texans and Mexico could stop." Santa Anna agreed that this might be a good plan, but the rest of Mexico didn't agree. Mexicans claimed that Santa Anna didn't have permission to sell Texas. He didn't even have permission to sign a treaty giving Texas its independence. Texas still belonged to Mexico. The Americans politely sent Santa Anna back to Mexico and ignored these objections. The citizens of the new Republic of Texas went on behaving like an independent nation. They voted to approve their constitution and elected Sam Houston president. For his new government, Sam Houston had a single wooden building in Austin. Texas didn't even have enough money to buy firewood to heat his office. He didn't have enough money to pay a regular army, and he knew that if Mexico attacked again, Texas might well lose. The solution was simple: join the United States. If Texas became a state, all of the U.S. Army would march to its defense. Many Texans weren't anxious to give up any of their brand new independence, and not everyone in Washington wanted Texas to join the United States. Americans who opposed slavery pointed out that Texas would be a slave-owning state. Texas was so huge that once it became a state, the slave-holding areas of the United States would more than double. Others objected that Texans were rough, crude, violent troublemakers. But after 10 years, it's a pretty long time, you guys. After 10 years of arguing, the people of the Republic of Texas finally voted to join the United States, and the United States Congress agreed to accept them. "Be it resolved," Congress wrote on March 1st, 1845, "that a state to be formed out of the present Republic of Texas, with 2 representatives in Congress, shall be admitted into the Union on an equal footing with the existing states." Okay, I just noticed Kiddo said, in our book it says March 1st, 1845. Maybe that is just when Congress wrote this into law, and then it was official maybe December 29th, 1845. I'm not sure. That's something that would need to be checked out. All right, let's continue. At once, Mexicans protested that the United States had stolen their land. Bands of Mexican and American soldiers roamed along the border between Texas and Mexico, shooting at each other. Finally, the United States declared war on Mexico. This war would do more than claim Texas. The United States planned to drive Mexico out of North America altogether. Mexico still claimed to own land in the north and west of the old Texas Republic. The United States would capture this territory too. "We must march from Texas straight to the Pacific Ocean," one congressman exclaimed. One young congressman from Illinois disagreed. Abraham Lincoln. You guys have heard of Abraham Lincoln, who later would become president. Abraham Lincoln had not served in Congress for very long, but when the United States Army marched over the Mexican border, headed towards Mexico City, Abraham Lincoln objected. It was wrong, he said, to send an army into Mexico itself, into the midst of a peaceful Mexican settlement, frightening the inhabitants away, leaving their growing crops and other property to destruction. Lincoln and other protesters were outvoted. United States soldiers fought their way toward Mexico City. Santa Anna had been living quietly on a country farm in Cuba, disgraced by his defeat in Texas. But now he decided to return to Mexico. He rode through the country, begging Mexicans to follow him once more. "Once you called me soldier of the people," he shouted. "Allow me to take that title again, and I will devote myself till death to the defense of our liberty and independence." The Mexican army poured out to meet Santa Anna and acclaimed him as their leader. As the Americans drew close to Mexico City, Santa Anna prepared to meet them at a village nearby. He ordered his soldiers to dig trenches and build barriers around 3 sides of the Mexican camp, but he decided that no army could manage to cross the high hills behind the army, so he left those hills undefended. Probably not a good idea. The general commanding the United States soldiers at once sent a young captain named Robert E. Lee to climb those hills. Robert E. Lee built a system of posts and ropes that the Americans could use to haul their cannons and ammunition up to the hilltops. The next morning, the Americans attacked Santa Anna's army from all sides at once. Santa Anna was forced to call a retreat. With American soldiers pouring through the streets of Mexico City, the Mexican Congress agreed to sign a peace treaty, as long as the United States paid the Mexican government for the land it was losing. In 1848, there we go. My computer went and changed screens. Okay. In 1848, the United States paid Mexico $15 million. In return, Mexico gave up Texas and another piece of land where California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, and part of New Mexico now lie. A few years later, the United States paid Mexico another $10 million for the rest of New Mexico. The Mexican-American War was finally over, and the United States of America now held most of the land it owns today. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a couple of things really quick with you to make sure that you understood. So what happened to Santa Anna? What happened to him? So Santa Anna, he didn't think that the Texas soldiers were a threat, so his men took an afternoon nap. That was a mistake because Sam Houston's men attacked them while they were sleeping. Santa Anna surrendered and he was sent to Washington, D.C. So my other question is, how did Texas become a state? Well, Texas became a state because Sam Houston, he became president, but he didn't have enough money for an army. So Texans voted to join the United States. This was after 10 years, though, of being an independent republic. So the U.S. Army, they ended up invading Mexico and marched into Mexico City. Santa Anna and his men fought back, but they lost the war. So Mexico agreed to give up land in return for $15 million. So that is how Texas became a state. I want to leave you today with some more words of encouragement from the Bible. I know one of these I had up yesterday, but I wanted to go over it again. The new one is, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And that's Joshua 1:9. We have nothing to be afraid of. We know we can be strong and courageous because God will always be there to protect us and watch over us. And remember, again, as I said yesterday, Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. Colossians 3:23. Remember, we need to work our best and our hardest for the Lord, because maybe nobody else is watching you, but the Lord is watching you, and He knows, even when you're alone, He knows when you're doing good things. All right, kiddos. I miss you guys, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day. Bye.